Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 6, Come Ye Rogues, Come Ye Rogues. Last time, we talked about the Chesapeake colonies during the English Civil War. Both Maryland and Virginia had sided with the king against Parliament. When the Royalist side lost, Virginia remained loyal to the king's exiled son, Charles II. But after a few years, the new Republican government in England sent a small fleet to the Chesapeake to bring the colonies into line. Virginia surrendered without a fight under favorable terms, but William Claiborne continued his vendetta against Maryland by overthrowing their government yet again. But he'd gone too far and the old proprietary system under Lord Baltimore was largely restored. So things hadn't really changed too much. The colonies were still largely running their own affairs, just with new management. Today, I'm going to talk about the history of the Chesapeake in the 1650s, during Cromwell's Protectorate and its immediate aftermath, as well as Maryland's history for the 2 decades after that. As I said last time, Parliament pretty clearly didn't want to expend the time or the effort to govern its American colonies. They kept putting off important decisions. For instance, now that the monarchy was overthrown, Virginia needed a new charter to formally authorize its government. Without one, Virginia was basically being run on the basis of tradition and the changes that had been imposed during its surrender. Promises kept being made that a charter was on the way, but nothing ever came of it. England was far too concerned with events at home. Despite the end of the Civil War, Britain was still in turmoil. The king had been executed, but that didn't mean that Parliament had come up with a workable new system of government. Divisions that had been papered over by a shared opposition to the king re-emerged. As Parliament kept failing to govern, Oliver Cromwell, a successful parliamentarian general, stepped in to fill the power vacuum. In 1653 he became Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. That is, a dictator in all but name. So while that drama was playing out across the Atlantic, Virginia was pretty much left to run itself under an increasingly assertive House of Burgesses. Under the new political arrangement, both the governor and the upper house of the legislature, the council, were chosen by the Burgesses in the lower house rather than being appointed in England. This was closer to how things were done in New England, but it's still quite radical when you think about it. Shockingly democratic. All power was, in a very real sense, flowing from the people. Or at least all the freemen who could vote. I guess it's not surprising that while England was embarking on its radical experiment in republican government, Virginia would follow suit. And that power wasn't just nominal or anything. The assembly really was in control. The Burgesses successfully fended off attempts by the governors to assert anything in the way of real authority over them. For instance, in 1658, the governor tried to dissolve the sitting assembly and hold new elections. But the Burgesses declared that only they had the right to do that. They then removed the governor from office. And then they appointed him as governor again, basically just to prove that they could. This also meant that all lower offices were now ultimately in the hands of the assembly as well, though in practice governors still had some power over those appointments. There were around 37 Burgesses at this time, incidentally. The number was slowly growing as more and more counties were created to handle the continuing influx of migrants, but the number was still quite low. Now that Virginia was less subject to English control, the Assembly loosened restrictions on commerce. In order to reduce Virginia's economic dependence on England, they encouraged trade with the Dutch, who had settled in what would become New York. And the Virginians also took this opportunity to expand their settlements further and steal Indian land with even more speed than usual. There were limits, however. The Virginians still needed to remain on the good side of Parliament. Most of the elected officials would have been royalists, and many of them had been in the House of Burgesses off and on since before the overthrow of the monarchy. But the governors they selected were moderate parliamentarians. Relatively powerless parliamentarians, but hopefully enough to appease England. Claiborne still held office, incidentally, though never as governor. But importantly, this new system of government had been imposed from the outside rather than fought for by the people of Virginia. They didn't believe in it. Virginians were still royalists. They were biding their time, hoping for a restoration of the monarchy and a return to the way things had been before. It's not that they wanted to be dominated by governors sent from England. They were certainly willing to fight assertively for their own interests. The thrusting out of Governor Harvey had proved that. But they weren't interested in the sort of radicalism proposed by the parliamentarian faction. So this new system was purely an expedient. It did not herald a new era of democratic control and self-rule. And it's important to note that the Burgesses were the only elected officials in all of Virginia. Every other position was appointed. That was true before, during, and after this period. So in practice, most important positions were quite well insulated from popular pressure. Most actual interaction that people had with the government was at the county level, and those officials were all appointed rather than elected. And the burgesses themselves were increasingly coming from the ranks of local officials, who were themselves increasingly coming from the local social elite. So a burgess, a county magistrate, and a local plantation owner would all come from the same social circle, or they might even be the same individual. Basically, every burgess was also an appointed local official. Remember, by this point, Virginia's population was in the tens of thousands, so it was increasingly the case that there was a stable social elite to draw from. I'll talk about this a lot more next episode. It was also around this time that the right to vote began to become more limited in Virginia. Perhaps the high watermark of electoral openness came in 1646, when a law was passed mandating that all freemen attend elections for the House of Burgesses, or pay a fine of 100 pounds of tobacco. Not only were freemen allowed to vote, they were now required to vote. This requirement would remain for the rest of the colonial period. And up until this point, the limits on the right to vote had been unclear. Certainly all freemen could vote, and servants were in an ambiguous position. It might not have been traditional for them to vote, but they don't seem to have been explicitly banned either. It's quite possible that at least some servants did in fact vote. But in the 1650s, that changed. First, the Assembly passed an extremely restrictive bill, which limited the right to vote to just the heads of households. This excluded all servants and even many freemen. But it proved too unpopular. Virginians saw it as, quote, hard and unagreeable to reason that any persons shall pay equal taxes and yet have no votes in elections. So a new law was passed, which re-expanded the right to vote to all freemen. But this was still more restrictive than before. Servants were now officially unable to vote. This is a pattern that will play out more as time goes on. Over the next few decades, property requirements would be added, further restricting the franchise. The migration of richer, more elite families, coupled with the economics of tobacco production, meant that a planter aristocracy was coming to dominate Virginia. The period of social fluidity was coming to an end. The changes wrought by the English Civil War weren't enough to overcome that. The slow development of Virginia in this direction was more important than the temporary surface changes. But while things in Virginia remained pretty calm, Maryland was as unsettled as ever. You'll recall that last episode, William Stone, a Protestant, had been made governor of Maryland in 1649. Lord Baltimore, the proprietor of the colony, had probably named Stone as governor in part to placate the Puritans in order to avoid losing control of Maryland altogether. Stone had then invited a group of Puritans living in Virginia to take refuge in more tolerant Maryland. A group of 400 to 600 Puritans took him up on the offer. They moved to the mouth of the Severn River, about 50 miles north of St. Mary's City, which was then the capital of Maryland. They named their new settlement Providence, though it's now known as Annapolis, the current capital of Maryland. Maryland's population had never been very big to begin with, numbering at most a few thousand around this time. And that small number had been seriously depleted by the instability of the last few years. So as groups such as the Puritans began to arrive, Maryland went from being majority Protestant to overwhelmingly Protestant. But the leaders of the colony remained in part Catholic, although even there their control was slipping, as seen in the need to appoint a Protestant governor. This was part of the reason why the Assembly felt the need to finally pass a formal act of religious toleration. It was as much for the benefit of the Catholic overlords as for their Protestant subjects. This was the situation when Claiborne briefly overthrew the government again in 1652. Although his action was reversed and the old system largely put back in place, that didn't mean that things in Maryland were settled. It was entirely possible that back in England Parliament could decide to replace Maryland's government with something of its own devising, or even just dissolve Maryland back into Virginia. Certainly the Protestants of Maryland wanted Lord Baltimore removed. At one point it seemed like that might actually happen, but the political turmoil in England again derailed any changes in the colonies. Having kept control of Maryland in part through dumb luck, Lord Baltimore then tried to reconsolidate his control over the colony. In late 1653 he sent word to Governor Stone that from now on, everyone in Maryland would be required to swear an oath of loyalty to him as proprietor of the colony. Anyone who refused would lose all of their lands. To say this led to a backlash would be an understatement. The new Puritan colonists objected strongly to swearing an oath to a Catholic lord, and they felt that they were under no obligation to do so. They had been hoping that Lord Baltimore would be gone altogether. In July next year, William Claiborne and another ally took advantage of the unhappiness in the colony, and yet again sailed up to St. Mary's City, and yet again overthrew the government. For the, let me check, third time. With the support of the Puritans and of Kent Island, which still resented Maryland's authority, their job was easy. But rather than simply let the colony fall back into chaos as they had during the plundering time, now Claiborne and a few others took power as a sort of executive council. Maryland's new leaders moved quickly. They called for new elections to the General Assembly, with voting rights now restricted to Protestants. This new assembly, according to Wesley Craven, quote, repudiated the proprietor's authority in its entirety, repealed his statute of religious tolerance, and by one of the most ungenerous acts of colonial times, deprived Catholics of the protection of law. Clearly the Puritans felt no special gratitude for having been given refuge in Maryland. They were out to win. I suspect the actual goal here was to establish Protestant control over Maryland in practice, in hopes that Parliament would find it easier to just go along with the change rather than give back control to someone who was, after all, a Catholic. And while Virginia was still royalist at heart, they didn't have too many objections to the ousting of Catholics in the name of Protestantism. So Claiborne had good reasons to think that his plan would succeed. But, early the next year, a ship arrived in Virginia from England, bearing a letter from Lord Protector Cromwell. It was to the ousted William Stone, and it addressed him as governor. As far as I can tell, the letter had been written before word of the coup had reached England, so Cromwell would have had no idea what was going on. But Stone nevertheless took it to mean that he was still recognized as governor by England. Seizing the opportunity, he took a small force up from Virginia to St. Mary's City and ousted those who had ousted him. Stone continued north to Providence, home of the Puritans, to restore Maryland's authority there. The two sides met on March 25th, in what would become known as the Battle of the Severn. Each side had 150 men, give or take. According to a Puritan propaganda pamphlet, quote, the enemy appeared in a body upon a narrow neck of the land, near their vessels, and with drums and shoutings, said, come ye rogues, round-headed dogs. But the Puritans got the better of Stone's forces after a quick charge. Over a third of his men were wounded or killed, and most of the rest were captured, including Stone himself. According to the same propagandist, quote, the blood which they thirsted after in others was given to themselves in drink. The miseries which they threatened to the innocent fell upon the guilty. The pit which they digged for others themselves fell into. The cords which they brought to bind us bound themselves. No doubt Stone and his men would have disputed that account, but they were given blood to drink. Stone and 8 of his men were sentenced to die, despite promises of clemency made when they had surrendered. 4 men were killed within a few days, but the sentences of Stone and the others were commuted after pleas for mercy from some of the residents of Providence, and they were eventually released. Counting the executions, 23 men had been killed in all. So the Puritans remained in control of Maryland, but not for long. Back in England, Lord Baltimore successfully got Parliament to acknowledge his continuing status as proprietor of Maryland. Unfortunately, the exact reasons don't survive. Perhaps Parliament was simply hesitant to strip a lord of his property, even a Catholic lord. Whatever the case, without support from Parliament, the Puritan leaders in Maryland had no choice but to capitulate. In 1657, a truce between Baltimore and the Puritans was agreed to, and a general amnesty was declared. In early 1658, Josiah Svendal took control of the colony as governor on behalf of Baltimore. He was one of the men who had narrowly escaped execution after the Battle of the Severn. The Puritans were reintegrated into Maryland's government, and the act guaranteeing religious toleration was passed back into law. But, somehow, this settlement still wasn't enough to bring peace and stability to Maryland. Only this time the disruption didn't come from Claiborne or the Puritans. It came from within the establishment itself. Baltimore's authority had been re-established in the colony, yes, but that didn't mean that the colonists were happy about it, particularly about the fact that despite all the turmoil and despite the conditions in the colony, his official power remained near absolute. None of the rebellions had actually negotiated that power away. They looked to self-governing Virginia to the south and saw a much better model for self-rule. Even if you disliked the Puritans, that certainly didn't mean that you actually liked Baltimore. The fundamental problems of Maryland were still unresolved, which became apparent in 1660. That year, the lower house of the Assembly led a legal attack on Baltimore's authority, trying to make it entirely symbolic. The lower house declared itself to be an independent body capable of making laws on its own, without need for any approval from the proprietor. Governor Fendall mostly agreed to this, saying that all laws passed by the Assembly, quote, were to be published in his lordship's name and then to be in full force. In other words, Lord Baltimore's control of the colony was to be entirely nominal. Things could be done in his name even if he disapproved. The upper and lower houses were again merged into a single body, this time in order to weaken the veto power of the appointed officials. Clearly, Maryland wanted de facto self-rule. However, this little legal rebellion proved to be spectacularly ill-timed, thanks to events in England. In late 1658, Oliver Cromwell had died, after only 5 years as Lord Protector. His son, Richard Cromwell, was appointed in his place, but he proved unable to hold things together and resigned within months. This threw Britain back into political confusion. Parliament had proven incapable of governing England on its own, and now the Cromwells had failed to turn into a dynasty. So, now what? As it turns out, it was time for a restoration. Charles II, the exiled son of the beheaded Charles I, returned to reclaim his kingdom. In early 1660, he landed in England. He faced little resistance as he marched towards London. The Republic had failed, utterly. Everyone agreed it was time to bring back the monarchy. This, of course, was happening at exactly the same time as Maryland was trying to buck authority. Charles, after all he'd been through, would have none of it. After taking the throne, he quickly reaffirmed Baltimore's charter in full. Word was sent to the Chesapeake, and the revolt in Maryland collapsed. Fendall was replaced as governor by Lord Baltimore's brother, Philip Calvert, the second of his brothers to serve as governor of the colony. Fendall was sentenced to death, but this was commuted to a simple disbarment from holding office again. As was the recurring pattern, nobody was really punished. It was, in the words of a contemporary, a, quote, pygmy rebellion. In Virginia, the restoration of Charles II of course went much more smoothly. In the late 1650s, rumors of the changes taking place back in England swirled and trickled into Virginia. No one knew how things would end up, which faction would wind up on top. Probably the colonists would have preferred to bide their time before choosing sides, but a decision was forced upon them. The current governor died in 1660 and the Assembly had to choose a new one. Whoever they picked would send a message to England about their loyalties. But they didn't know who would be running England. Given the delay in sending messages across the Atlantic, they didn't know who was running England now. In the end, they went with old William Berkeley, the royalist governor who had been forced out by the parliamentary fleet in 1652. He was now in his mid-50s. He had spent the decade on his plantation, quietly biding his time and avoiding trouble. In choosing him, the Virginians weren't quite overthrowing parliamentary authority yet, but they were preparing the way. And they chose wisely. 2 months after Berkeley regained his office, Charles regained his throne. As soon as word reached Virginia, allegiance was officially shifted back to the monarchy without trouble. Recent laws were amended or repealed as necessary to bring the colony into line with the new order. The king chose to retain Berkeley as governor since, in Charles's eyes, he had never been lawfully removed in the first place. And it perhaps helped that 2 of Berkeley's brothers were intimate friends of the king. Basically, things were to go back to the way they were before the Civil War. The power of the burgesses was to be reduced and the governor was to be appointed in England again. There was one further significant change, though. From 1662 onwards, elections to the House of Burgesses ceased. Don't get me wrong, the House of Burgesses still met and passed laws, it was just the same men as before, year after year. Berkeley simply never dissolved the Assembly. He kept calling the old one back each time. Berkeley was no Democrat, and he now had an assembly he found agreeable, so why change things? Ever. After the recent chaos, no one was going to complain. Elections were still held from time to time as members resigned or died, but there were no colony-wide elections. Just one, ongoing, easily controlled assembly. This paralleled a development in England. When Charles II took the throne, a new parliament was elected, one filled with supporters of the king. His father had tried to rule without parliament altogether and failed, but ruling with a pliant parliament kept around indefinitely was an even better way to make sure that the king's will was enforced. So Charles simply left his new parliament in place for the next 18 years without ever calling for new elections. Berkeley's assembly wouldn't last quite that long, but it did come pretty close. It was also around this time that William Claiborne retired from public life to live out the rest of his days on his plantation. He died in the late 1670s, still petitioning the crown for recompense for having lost Kent Island all those decades ago. He was, I think, in the end, a mostly inconsequential figure in the long run. His repeated attacks on Maryland were disruptive, but in the end they didn't amount to much. There were yet more rebellions against the proprietary government after he left the stage, after all. He undoubtedly worsened things, but it seems likely to me at least that Maryland was destined to be less stable than Virginia in those early decades. Someone or something would have come to set things off. But what was it that made Maryland so unstable? Depending on how you count, the government of Maryland had been temporarily overthrown 5 times in the last 15 years, and the instability will continue for decades to come. Compare that with Virginia, which had been far more stable overall. Even when the General Assembly lost its official recognition, even when they expelled a governor, and even when they were forced to surrender to Parliament at gunpoint, Virginia had, for the most part, just kept on going. So what gives? What accounts for the difference? I think you can point to a few things. I think that the biggest factor was the religious mismatch between the top and bottom of Maryland society. A large majority of elected delegates from 1661 to 1689 were Protestants, but the council was again majority Catholic, now that Lord Baltimore no longer had to appease Puritans at home. 19 out of 32 appointed councillors in that period were Catholic. The problem wasn't exactly religious diversity. There were now a variety of different Protestant groups in Maryland, and they all got along well enough with each other. The problem was that the few Catholics were all at the top. It had to feel to the Protestants like they were being ruled by foreigners or enemies, given the circumstances of the day. If the Catholics had just been citizens, their presence wouldn't have been so disruptive. And on top of that, the proprietor really did have a lot of power. Or at least he had a lot of legal authority. Just like in Virginia, power was very naturally concentrating within the colony itself and within the Assembly. In Episode 4, I talked about how Maryland's legislature was becoming more professional and independent. And it was, but those changes were mostly de facto rather than de jure. The proprietor could still in principle do much as he willed. So there was an increasing mismatch between nominal power and real power, which also mapped onto the religious divide. Revolts against the Catholic authorities were as much revolts against overweening authority as against Catholicism, although religion was obviously a useful rallying point. Add to that the repeated disruptions from Virginia, and it's hardly surprising that there was so much unrest. I'd say the only surprising thing is that Lord Baltimore managed to hold on to Maryland at all. It's quite impressive, really, given the unnaturalness of his position. He managed to do so in the face of 2 decades of political turmoil and war and anti-Catholic hostility, with nothing on his side but legal rights, skillful politicking, and luck. He hadn't managed to turn Maryland into a Catholic haven, and he never would, but he had held on. I guess that counts for something. But he never managed to overcome the problems inherent in his position either. Rather than reaching for an accommodation with the Protestants, the Calverts tightened their grip. Lord Baltimore named his son, Charles Calvert, another Catholic, as governor in 1661, and he would remain in Maryland until 1684. This continuity helped them increase their control. For one thing, they began meddling in elections. The number of representatives sent from a given county was decreased, and the geographic size of electoral districts was increased, making the representation in government less representative. As a result, delegates now came from the higher classes. Most importantly, the right to vote was restricted to just landowners in 1670. 35 years ago, assemblies had been freewheeling meetings of every freeman in the colony. Now, only men who owned 50 acres of land or a comparable amount of property could vote. A dramatic shift. And as inequality increased in Maryland, that meant that a smaller and smaller proportion of men could vote. David W. Jordan estimates that in one county the percentage of free adult men who could vote declined from 55% in the 1680s to 44% in the 1700s to 33% in the 1730s. This shift was at almost exactly the same time that similar restrictions were being put in place in both Virginia and Massachusetts. Which may seem surprising to modern listeners who are used to the idea of voting becoming progressively more open and not the reverse. How did the men of the time justify themselves ideologically? After all, surely they had arguments beyond, we're rich and we can do what we want. They had two main lines of argument. The first was that elections were fundamentally a pragmatic matter, a means of ensuring good government and nothing more. Voting was not at all considered a right. You could only vote if you voting was going to make government work better. In the case of servants and the landless poor, the main concern was that they would be too beholden to their richer masters and would be unable to exercise independent judgment. The poor weren't self-governing in their own lives, even in a legal sense, so they couldn't be self-governing in general. In the words of John Adams a century later, quote, "Such is the frailty of the human heart, that very few men who have no property have any judgment of their own. They talk and vote as they are directed by some man of property who has attached their minds to his interest. They are to all intents and purposes as much dependent upon others, who will please to feed, clothe, and employ them, as women are upon their husbands or children on their parents." End quote. That statement also makes clear one reason why women were excluded. Even people who were considered radicals at the time worried about enfranchising the poor, fearing they would only enhance the power of the very wealthy. And since voting wasn't yet secret, they may have had a point. It was possible to control the votes of others, and even a secret ballot would only get you so far towards actual secrecy in such small communities. It would have been genuinely difficult to have fair votes in such circumstances, I think. Not impossible, but difficult. Which isn't to justify the ban, just to point out that the men of the time had reasons for excluding the poor that made sense to them and that weren't seen as cartoonishly evil power grabs. So that's the first argument. The poor would just meekly obey the wills of more powerful men. The second argument somewhat contradicted the first. People also worried that landless men would be too disruptive, since they had no lasting interest in their home and could pick up and move wherever they wished, so why bother with electing good representatives? Why not just take what you want from the state and move on? Or why not get drunk and riotous during the election? So instead of being docile and obedient, in this argument the poor are too unruly and self-interested. Those two views don't necessarily contradict each other. There could be different types of poor people, some rowdy, some not. But it is fair to ask whether or not the rich were being rather self-interested themselves in their reasoning. After all, politics in this era was heavily dominated by the elite, and winning office could be as much about personal favors as about policy. It was not good government by modern standards. But the rich weren't too keen to improve things by changing any of that, they just wanted to exclude the poor. And to speculate a little further, I have to imagine that in a society where voting isn't seen as a fundamental right, it's easier to get people to accept arguments to exclude this or that group from power. It's just not an issue that people are going to get emotional about. In the various protests throughout the 1600s, voting rights were a secondary concern at best. People cared, but it was never fundamental. And so, without passionate defense, voting rights were easier to curtail. And curtailed they were. But enough of my thoughts, let's get back to the Chesapeake. As a result of these changes, delegates increasingly came from the upper levels of Maryland society. Most of them also served as appointed officials in the local government. This meant that the governor could control who became an elected official by carefully choosing who became an appointed official. Governor Calvert also tried to imitate King Charles and Governor Berkeley by keeping around the same assembly indefinitely, but he only lasted 5 years before calling for new elections. The governor could also limit the size of the assembly by only summoning some of the elected members at a time. This, of course, meant that he could pick and choose the membership of the assembly, even in the face of popular support, by only summoning delegates friendly to him. With these sorts of tricks, Maryland's assembly was kept in check for a few decades. But the assembly was never powerless, and Marylanders learned to use it to their advantage. David Jordan also gives the interesting example of the Maryland Quakers. I'll talk much more about Quakers whenever we get to the founding of Pennsylvania, but for now, all you need to know is that they were a somewhat fringe religious sect whose members refused to swear oaths, believing that one should be perfectly honest at all times, not just under special circumstances. This was a problem for them, since holding office, testifying in court, and other official business all required swearing oaths. So in the 1670s, the Quakers organized a political campaign to get themselves and their sympathizers elected to the Assembly in order to pass a bill eliminating the need for such oaths. Assemblymen didn't have to swear oaths to hold office, if you were wondering. They weren't successful at first, but gradually they had their way. But the real point is that groups within the colony were figuring out how to manipulate the levers of government to make a desired change happen. And if the Quakers could do it, so could others. And everybody could learn from the mistakes of everyone else, and so gradually figure out the requirements for political success. So in response to this kind of popular pressure, the lower house became more assertive. But real changes wouldn't come until the further unrest of 1689. For now, the rights of the proprietor and of the assembly remained in unresolved tension. Next episode, we'll take a break from the narrative to spend some time looking at how Virginian society was changing over the second half of the 1600s. We'll look at the rise of both the planter aristocracy and of slavery as an institution in the Chesapeake, two crucial elements in the future history of America. So join me next time as we discuss Barclay's Virginia on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. And by the way, if you've enjoyed the podcast so far, please rate it or review it on iTunes. That would be a big help. Thanks for listening.